Sanchez, and welcome to Sonoma Views, where we talk real estate, property management, restaurant reviews, what's going on in Sonoma County, and everything in between. Thank you very much for being here. This topic is on real estate, the real estate transaction, more specifically even on a real estate transaction on a rental property with tenants that are currently under a lease, if you want to even get more specific. And I did a similar video to this already, but right now I'm literally driving back to the office. It is about 6:45 p.m. or so, 6:30, and I'm heading back to the office, and I have to work on some final disclosures, seller disclosures. We're getting ready for the closing, and the transaction is moving along. So I am representing the seller. I take that back. I'm representing the seller in the transaction. Now, this is a home that's currently a rental property that I manage. So funny how that works, huh? So I'm currently the property manager for a single-family home in Windsor. We have tenants in there who are currently under a lease agreement. Their lease does not expire until the end of June, and right now we're only in April, so they still have a couple months to go. So they're under a lease, but I'm the property manager and I'm the listing agent, so I am representing the property owners, the sellers of the property in the transaction. And we are getting close to closing. We're supposed to close escrow, close the transaction, close the sale next week. And the buyer's working on their end. The buyer's agent is working with her buyer, and they're getting the loan stuff taken care of, getting their loan, everything ready. And we're getting ready to close. And so what I have to do on my end, on the seller side, is I have to make sure, go back through the file top to bottom, and I'm doing my audit, pre-closing audit. And what that means, at least for me, is going through that file, making sure that I have all the required paperwork, all the disclosures, the nitty-gritty stuff, making sure all the signatures are on every page, making sure that they're dated, and not just by one side, but by both sides. So I have to make sure that my clients, the two sellers, have signed everywhere the sellers need to sign, and then make sure that I send over the paperwork to the buyer's agent so she can get the buyer and her buyers to sign and date everything where they're supposed to sign. So it's just this back and forth on paperwork. So that's what I'm on my way back to do. Now, one of the things that's happening, it's transpiring right now on this contract, is the buyer is almost at the end of the inspection period. So there's time period when the buyer is in the process of purchasing the property. We're in escrow. The transaction is moving forward, but the buyer has a certain amount of time to do all the investigations and inspections and reports that the buyer wants. Now, these are at the buyer's expense, and that's what I'm doing with today. And I think we'll have it all squared away now, so we could agree to move on. And by that I mean the buyer has the ability to request a number of things from the seller. Okay, I want to make sure I take it nice and slow here. I try to break everything down to plain English so everyone could understand. So when you're in the middle of an escrow, the buyer has a certain time frame. It could be, typically it's up to 17 days, but it could be any agreed upon time frame. So it could be 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, 15 days for a buyer to do the inspections, investigations of the property. And what that does, it allows the buyer enough time to do their own due diligence on the property, which they should be. The buyer should have the ability and diligently be able to go through and do all the inspections that they want, with the help of the real estate agent representing the buyer. Now, in this particular case, and I'll take it a level deeper here, in this particular case, before I put the property on the market for sale, I had already done a termite report, which is the pest report, a full home inspection, and I had done a roof inspection this is all pre-listing before the property goes on the market. And the reason I did that is because we have tenants still in there, and so it's not vacant. We have to schedule these things out, schedule access, and it does create a disruption with the tenants. So what I do is have those inspections done in advance, and in doing so, it allows us on the seller side to have a little bit more leverage, more control, because we already know the general condition of the property and whether or not there are any immediate, like, big ticket items that we should be aware of before the buyer finds out, because the buyer is going to go and do her own inspections. So right now we already had all our inspections done in advance, and then there were a couple things in the report that the buyer wanted to do some further investigation on. We had a lot of rain, so I'll share some specifics. We had so much rain that the ground itself was saturated. It was muddy under the house and the crawl space. So when they did the initial inspection, the home inspection and the termite inspection, it was just too muddy. The two inspectors couldn't get into the house, so they had to go back and do a second follow-up, which is a supplemental report. They will go back and do a follow-up inspection so they could complete all access of the property, which in this case was the under the house, which obviously, as you could imagine, it's really important. We have to make sure, are there any active leaks under there? Sewer leaks. Good thing we did check an air duct for the heating. The heating air duct was detached and it was just laying on the ground. That's not good, especially when you have heavy rains and storms and floods. You don't want that. So, and then there's a big tree. There's a big oak tree there. Now, one of the tricky things, and this is a delicate balance, because in this particular transaction, it is a rental. It's not vacant. So we still have a landlord-tenant relationship, and the landlord has responsibilities to maintain that property and keep the house habitable for the tenants. Meanwhile, you have a buyer who's coming along and looking at, okay, what are the things that need to be done to this property? And one of those is trimming the tree. There's a big oak tree that needs to be cut back, and it needs to be done for a safety precaution. The insurance agent is like, no way, that needs to be cut back. So it's a pending hazard. So we're going to get that taken care of. But the question comes into who. So we know who could do the work, which is going to be the arborist, but who is going to pay that bill? So we get into the nitty-gritty on the money and the repairs and the condition of the property. So even though the buyer and seller have already agreed on the sales price of the property and all the other conditions of the contract, the buyer, circling back here to the inspection period, the buyer still has the ability to, one, they could just back out. She could just back out and say, you know what, after doing the inspections, I found XYZ and I just want to back out. So the deal could be dead, which is not likely, not in this case anyway. But because we did our inspections beforehand, and it was almost $1,000 in reports, but it was well worth it. So one, the buyer could just back out. Two, the buyer, I'm giving you the options that the buyer has to present to the seller so we can move forward and agree on the final terms. And that's what we're doing today. The buyer could request for a repair. That's what it is. The buyer's request for repair. So the buyer could say, all right, we found, simple numbers, $2,000 worth of repairs that need to get done. So that buyer has the option to request, not demand, request that the seller do XYZ. And some of those options could be the buyer requests that the seller, that they reduce the sales price. Simple numbers. If we were at $500,000 purchase price, the buyers might say, okay, that thing needs $2,000 worth of work that we did not know about. Therefore, I'm asking for a reduction in sales price by $2,000. So you would go down to $498,000. Okay, that's a form of a credit. It's a price reduction, which is the real term. you're bringing down the purchase price by $2,000 to compensate for the $2,000 worth of repairs. Simple. Trying to keep it simple here. Simple numbers. So one, the buyer could request that the sales price be lowered. Two, they could agree on a new sales price, and again, it could be for the exact dollar amount of those repairs, but sometimes buyer and seller will agree to split the difference. So if you were at simple numbers, if your contract was $510,000 and the buyer discovers that there's $10,000 even worth of work or damage to the property, and they say, well, you know what, some of these things, they're not urgent, but they will need to get done. They need to be done, and I don't expect the seller to do it now, and we have tenants in there. It's a rental property. So instead of beating up the seller, making a strong demand, the buyer might just come in and say, okay, well, there's $10,000 of work, let's split the difference, and request a $5,000 reduction. So you meet halfway. All these are points of negotiability, of negotiation. That's the most important part that I want to emphasize. They're all negotiating points. So the buyer may request a reduction in price. They might request a credit. So I'm not going to do the repair right now. I'm aware that there's $10,000 worth of work, but I am requesting a X dollar amount credit to the buyer. So, all right, I know I'm into it for $10,000. I am asking the seller to contribute, to give me a credit, or give the buyer a credit at the closing. It's all part of the closing transaction, so it'll go towards their closing costs most often, so that the buyer ends up coming in with less money to close. I hope that makes sense, because I'm getting a little bit more technical here, but the buyer and seller will ultimately agree. Okay, the buyer is requesting these items. Then the other thing that could happen is, instead of the seller giving a credit to the buyer in the process, before they move forward and fully commit to purchasing this property, maybe they don't want money as a credit, or as a credit on the transaction, money credit. Maybe they want the seller to take an action, which is actually perform the repair before closing. Now this one, it's a great option. It certainly is. However, if you're running on an escrow and you have time periods, it may potentially delay the closing of your escrow. So that's what you need to know there. It could possibly delay you, because let's say, as an example, we want, there's termite, or there's a dry rot on the outside, and they want a siding painted. Great. The seller may agree to do it, but the contractors are backed up and they can't get that done. For the contractor that they have can't start for 2-3 weeks. So now you're stuck. You have an agreement to do it, but it's not going to be completed because we're relying on a third party. Okay, I gave you lots of information there. I'm at 13 minutes. I hope this information has been useful. I'm Chris Sanchez. This is Sonoma Views. And stay tuned. I hope you get to watch more videos and you learn more about real estate, property management, and the day in, day out crazy life in my job.